Do you have a couple of questions that have come in? Again, if you want to chat your questions to any of our speakers, which I'll ask each of them, if you're willing to keep your camera on, Helena, right now, and Dr. Beekins and Grady, if you want to come back on too and share your cameras. So we're going to be looking for your questions in the chat box, and if you are on Facebook, please share them in the comment space. We did get some questions in advance. We do have some questions that I've been getting via text as well as through the chat box. So I'll start off with one for Grady. So I really appreciate you spending your time when you're heading to your vacation, driving down the road. We got to see you earlier during your talk, driving down the road. I have a question here that says, like, do you coordinate with Florida or Mississippi? What about waterways that cross state lines? How do I know if I'm going to be exposed if I live across a border that shares a waterway?
Can you hear me? Because right now I can't get Okay. So we do have several waterways that cross into various other states. And the way we kind of coordinate that is each state is still responsible for their water. So if the Chattanooga River or, Tennessee, whatever we're talking about, if it falls on the Alabama side, that is going to be Alabama's responsibility. Whatever falls on the other state side is their responsibility. However, if it is close enough to the border that we know we're probably going to have impact on both sides of the state, we definitely are in touch with that state's Environmental Protection Agency. We let them know what's going on, particularly if it occurred on our side. And we kind of tell them where we are with it, what we've done, and hey, this is coming your way. So we definitely do coordinate with both of those, or coordinate with the other states in the event that we have a spill that's kind of spanning two different states. As far as how do you know you're protected, again, that's really going to be up to each state to inform their citizens and how they want to do that. We have 8 Region 4 states, it's southern states basically, and each one has a little bit different way of operating. So each state really has their own mechanisms in place to get that messaging out to their public and citizens and how they want to go about doing that.
So as a follow-up to that, we just got a message in the chat box for you, Grady. It's like, does Alabama pre-plan for oil spills? Example, geographical response plans, et cetera. And I know that you do, and you and I have been in area committee meetings, et cetera, with the U.S. Coast Guard. But so maybe you could expand on that a little bit about how Alabama pre-plans for oil spills.
We do pre-plan for oil spills. Again, the area contingency plan, we are fully involved with the U.S. Coast Guard down in Sector Mobile. We generally try to meet annually to look at that plan and update that plan as necessary. As a matter of fact, we actually have an event coming up in the next couple of weeks with the area contingency plan, and it actually involves several states. It involves the Mississippi, Alabama, and Florida. And so we are looking at trying to come up with what would be a worst case scenario spill for the Gulf region and how we would respond to it. So we definitely are always looking at that. We learned a lot from Deepwater Horizon. Obviously, that was something that, something like that is really hard to prepare for and plan. You can plan and plan, but something like that, you have to take your plans and implement them the best that you can. So those, as I said earlier, each incident is a little bit different. And when you're talking about something that scale, you plan for it. We do plan for it, but you always take lessons away from that and what you can do better. And we incorporate those into the plan after we respond to something like that. As far as inland spills, spills on our rivers and streams, we do have plans in place for that, but those are a little bit different as well. And then if you're talking about coastal water, so we have regional plans that we look at within the state, and those basically fall within state parameters. But we are always looking at how we can provide a better response to oil spills.
Thanks for that, Grady. So we have a couple other questions here too. I'm going to start with this one that was by the same person that asked a question of Grady. Is like, and this is for you, Dr. Beekins, why is it taking so long to clean up the aquifer in Bemidji? Is the RP not being proactive?
So the site I'm on, right? Yeah. So
yep, I can hear you.
Yeah, the site is out on state forest land. doesn't pose a risk to any drinking water sources. So it's been, the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency agreed that it could be a research and education site. One way to clean it up would be to dig up all the oil. So that's, that's a lot of digging. At this point, the site has been approved for no further action by the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. Because the benzene plume is stable.
So they've essentially said that it's basically would be more detrimental, you're saying, to dig out that aquifer and dig up the rest of the oil than to allow it to continue to degrade naturally.
Yes. Yeah.
So I had another question for you, Dr. Beekins, it says, I'm not a chemist, but are you saying that the type of test that is used might determine whether researchers know if people's health were impacted?
That's the hypothesis that we are exploring at the moment. We know that the total petroleum hydrocarbon measurement does not capture these transformation products. And so what we're trying to figure out is whether there's a human health impact. So the cells that we tested were human liver cells, but those were in vitro assays. So that you have to determine if there's an adverse outcome pathway that goes with that upregulation of those transcription factors. So the aryl hydrocarbon receptor would be in the classic compounds that are used that are expected to be activated by the aryl hydrocarbon receptor, polyaromatic hydrocarbons, as we were discussing in the sand risk study, and also chlorinated polyaromatic hydrocarbons, or halogenated. So
just as a follow-up for those of us that are not involved in these types of studies, could you just briefly explain what in vitro means and what that means when we talk about something being upregulated?
Right, so in vitro means a cell-based test that's conducted outside of an organism in a laboratory. So in vivo would be the opposite, which is an actual organism is exposed. And then upregulated means that the gene that's activated is, there's more activity transcribing that gene than there is in a cell that's exposed only to the solvent control. So some of the liver cells are exposed only to DMSO, and others are exposed to this extracted groundwater. And the tests
Thank you for that clarification. Thank you so much for that clarification. So for Dr. Sola-Gabriel, I have a question here that came in from one of our registrants in advance. Is it safe to go to the beach with my toddler after a storm? Is the unburied oil present in amounts harmful if they're ingested?
I believe that the main message that we'd like to express is that whenever possible, practice hygiene, safe hygiene. So if I would not encourage the children to play with the tar balls. I mean, you may want to advise that, you stay away, and definitely not to ingest it. But there's incidental, that one day is not going to have a huge impact over the lifetime. Is when you have repetitive, and it happens over maybe a period of many years, is when you would start needing to be concerned about the behaviors over the long term. And so what would be encouraged is more so if you are in that situation where you're at a beach, that there are tar balls, maybe keep an eye on the children and ask them to stay away from them and do the best you can to make sure they don't play with them. And then make sure that they wash their hands before they eat, and when you get home, shower and bathe. And so I would recommend that if it's a one-time, you know, few times, it would not be a huge increase in the overall risk over the child's lifetime. So, but you always want to be cautious. Yes, yes.
Where you were talking about acute versus long-term exposure for things. So I have a couple follow-up questions for you. First question from Facebook is, I lived on the Mississippi Gulf Coast after Deepwater Horizon, and my 5- and 8-year-old children played on the beaches there occasionally in areas protected by island chains and local booms, etc. However, during that time, but is there a way to calculate how much more at risk an area like that would have been? And I had another question where people were pretty much asking, okay, so I had children that were there at Deepwater Horizon, maybe weren't directly exposed, but went back to the beaches after they were opened up. How do we understand what potential long-term health impacts might be for these children and what kind of risk parents maybe need to be looking out for?
Okay, to answer the first question about the differences in the beaches, maybe some that may be more impacted than others, I would presume that for the most part, the children's behavior may be the same at the both beaches. You know, the dose response, all the calculations on the back end would be more or less the same. It's the front end that would be a little different. So it would be the concentration. So we would start by comparing the chemical concentrations of, let's say, the polyaromatic hydrocarbons at the two beaches. And we can run the calculations through and then figure out what the differences in risk are. Now, when it comes to risk, it's not like a fraction more, 10%, or we're talking orders of magnitude differences is what drives differences in risk later on down the line. So I don't know the answer to that question. It would be interesting to get chemical concentration measures and compare the two beaches of one that has never been impacted versus one that has been impacted by DWH in this fashion. A lot depends on the timing too, because once the beach is impacted, there's a natural process of degradation that happens. So there's a lot of factors that would influence the concentration, what I'm trying to say. So I think the main thing would be to check in on the concentration differences. The other question was about long-term effects and what to be concerned about. In terms of the long-term impacts, as I mentioned during the presentation, we did run through the calculations with children's actual activities. And given the information that we do have, which is toxicity information on PAHs, again, the long-term risks such as cancer were on the 1 in a million time risk level. But we don't have information on toxicity for some of these other chemicals that are found in oil, so we don't know what those risks would be. So what we recommend is that more toxicity studies, we don't do toxicity studies, but you know, researchers conduct more toxicity studies on these other chemicals that are degradation products of the PAHs as examples. The alkylated PAHs are the ones that we're interested. I think it's important that there's more work done on those.
I really appreciate that clarification and more in-depth explanation of that. There's one other question, Helena, for a participant, basically saying it appears you use EPA sample data to determine concentration. How can EPA data taken from the mouth of the Mississippi River Delta be used to model exposure risk on Florida beaches?
Okay, what we did here is we looked specifically at DWH and impacts from DWH under those conditions. Now, in terms of what's going to happen in Florida, it's a very different environment. The sand is very different. The weather conditions are very different. I would anticipate that and the oil would be different too. What we're proposing is that in order for this to work, you have to have concurrent measurements at the same time as the oil spill is occurring, so that you can use those measurements to then relate areas that have been impacted with concentration. So I would love to be able to develop a model that we can forecast concentration regardless of environment, regardless of oil. I wish we could do that. But right now, what we know can be done is to concurrent measurements during the actual spill can be used, especially in a spill that takes 87 days. you can use that information to then forecast what may be happening the next day or a week from then, based on the trajectory models.
Thank you for
so
doing that.
I guess I would love to be able to forecast what would happen in Florida.
Right? I mean, this is science.
Yeah, the oceanographic models, I think, need to be developed further to separate out the individual chemicals. And they don't split out.
Which I think is one of the great advantages of having this great 10 years effort of the Gomery Research Initiative too, is that we really have significantly improved our ability to model fate and transport in the Gulf. And that has benefited our ability to understand weather patterns and harmful algal blooms and all manner of things that specifically relate to ocean circulation in our systems here. And those models and the technologies used to create those models are applicable to a number of other places. So I am going to share my screen briefly right here and kind of sum everything up for everybody. So I do want to say that our evaluation link is sitting down in your chat box right now. I believe it's also been posted onto the Facebook Live link. So if you guys would please take a moment and fill out that evaluation, click on that link and fill out that evaluation. It is really very vital in terms of us understanding what your needs are, what questions need to be asked, additional issues that you would like to hear us address, how to improve future webinars, seminars, workshops that we're working on. I also want to say that we have some additional workshops or webinars that are coming up. The part 3 of the human health webinar, it says August 22nd, but it's really the week following August 22nd now. It looks like all of our speakers have confirmed, and we're just trying to narrow down the specific dates we're going to use. So look for the week of August 24th for the 3rd installment that specifically is related to dispersants. We also have a 3rd installment of our webinar series specifically related to oysters that is also about the same time towards the end of August. So expect some type of announcement in this next coming week on specific dates and times for those upcoming webinars. If you have any additional questions, please contact me, put them in the chat box. We'll keep this chat box and the webinar open for a couple more minutes so that people can click on that evaluation link. At this time, I do really want to thank Grady, Barbara, and Helena so much for taking your time to share your experiences, your research, your work with our audience members. And Grady, go on vacation and catch some fish for us. And the rest of you, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you.